in Law in Early Colonial Bengal by Professor Ruchika Sharma, who is an assistant professor of history at Mata Sundari College for Women, University of Delhi. Her research interests include gender studies, Mughal architecture, East India Company, early modern history, women's studies, concept of Asian Kama Sutra, Indian art, history of domestic service, British imperial and colonial history, and so on. Her works include Engendering Shringara, Procuring Love, that is Sakhi, Duti, and Go Between and Priti, poetry. The Indian Dancing Girl in early colonial travel writing, Domesticity in early colonial Bengal, amongst many others. We welcome you, ma'am.
I'm really glad to be here, especially glad because this is the college where it all started for me. This is where my love for history and love for teaching history, I think, and ma'am has taught me in first year college. So I think, yes, the genesis of this book would have been perhaps in this place where there were so many excellent teachers who loved history. They made us also fall in love with the discipline of history beyond the classroom. We would spend so much time in the libraries, etc. So yes, I'm glad to be back. Thank you so much for having me. So this talk today is titled Retrieving Women's History, Concubinage, Race and Law in Early Colonial Bengal. Before I speak about my book, a quick dedication to two people, Professor Ajandala, again another old Stephanian, and my supervisor for the PhD which turned into the book, and my mother. Both of them have been there throughout the journey, so I thought I should mention them. Also, this fact that the cover of my book has been made by another old Stephanian, my best friend Nafisa Ali Motiwala, who's an art historian and also an artist. So she recreated a will that I'd sent her to do that. I'll speak about my sources and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, so why do I say retrieving women? Women don't need to be retrieved. We're already there, right? But we often hear when you start talking about women's history, it's very difficult to do women's history. Women are not there in history. You know, kahan hai aur? They're in it, right? It's only when you start asking new questions from your archives, you realize that women have existed. One of the foremost scholars I would like to speak about is Ruchika, who in her book Domesticity and Power challenged the very idea that domestic versus public, you know, it's not a binary. And even if you see it as two different spaces, domestic is as much power-ridden as is private, public and political. So, therefore, when we look at women's history, the question is, how do we find women? All the history written so far tells us it's difficult to write women's history, but are we asking our archives the right kind of question? Second, are we broadening what we call our sources and our archive? So, the biggest challenge that I had when I began my research was if I want to look at women in 18th century Bengal, women who were living in the households of the British men who came to Bengal, and by Bengal I mean Bengal presidency of 18th century, how do I find them? The two places I thought of looking for them, one were, of course, the baptism records of the children of mixed race families, where if the woman was a native, quote unquote native, the mother's name will be a question. So that was a short way of knowing that this particular child who baptized, the mother must have been a non-European. The second was the baptism record, the cemetery where the children who died at an early age. In the parentage, if the father's name is there as the British man, if the mother's name had a question mark, again you know that the mother was a non-European woman. So the third source was the legal archive for me. And by legal archive, I mean the court were fought in the Calcutta Supreme Court, which was established in 1773. And the second sources were the wills that were left by the British men, who wrote their wills talking about who they were bequeathing, what exactly, who are executed of the will, etc. These wills were filed in the Supreme Court. High Court now, because right now it's called the High Court Calcutta, and that time the Supreme Court. So the wills actually begin from the mid to late 1870s, sorry, 1770s, I'm so sorry, 1773, did I say 1873? Yeah, sorry, 1770s, 1773 is Supreme Court established, and 1774, 5 onwards the wills have been filed. These are the early wills, and these wills, you would imagine somebody is bequeathing something. These wills are extremely elaborate. They will not just tell you who are they bequeathing the things to. They will talk about sometimes the story of how they met. Okay? The story of, if after I leave for Britain, please make sure my BB, who is in the Baganbari, in Bangla, Baganbari means garden house, which is a notion of being elite and rich. It's like having a farmhouse in today's world. It's like a farmhouse of elites actually. So from the Baganbari, when you bring her to the city, make sure you bring her comfortably by getting a nice, comfortable boat ride. So this is how much detail they will go into at times in the wills. So I realized that wills are not just mathematical details of how much money, how much jewelry, but they become a sort of a letter, a declaration of sorts. The other word which is problematic in this is the word native. I know it's a very loaded word, and one should be really careful in using this word. After all, who is native and who is not? It's a political debate, and it should be. Here, the reason why I use the word native is most of the archive uses the word native for anybody who is not 100% European. So people have been coming, Europeans have been coming to India from 15th century onwards, and after some time even they might not remember how much European descendants they may have. Some, again a class issue becomes important here, who have documentation, who keep records, who have letters, private papers, etc. They would know all the details, others may not. So oftentimes native will describe somebody who's not 100% European. Even a mixed race person might be referred to as native in the colonial archive. This is a copy of a will, kind of a recreation of a will here. And I will talk about the idea that how do historians speak of language. Do historians work on language? Can we analyze the language? Or the words somebody uses for somebody? We live in a very, very careful world, no? We are very cautious of what word we use. If I'm WhatsApping my teacher, a hi is too informal, a hello seems too uncool to call, hey is then the, or even better, halo, right? They're so cautious in picking up even the word of greeting for somebody. So as historians, do we engage with the literary, milieu of a time we are studying? I would suggest we do, because language carries a lot of cues with itself. Not just the words we use, but why we use those words. And why this word and why not the other word. So, my book starts with this chapter called Beyond the Parda. Now, of course, when you are looking at European presence in India, you realize they are writing a lot of travelogues. And yes, travelogues have their own politics and their own problem. The fact that for a traveler from Europe, everything is exotic. But from that exotic days, they often mention those aspects for us they are mundane, but for them they would have been something extremely noteworthy. So at times when the critical gaze, when you do pick up a travelogue, you also want to remember that you can't treat things as exotic, but at the same time, so the idea of Beyond the Parda for me was, when travelers are writing their travelogue, if they are sexualizing the women behind the parda, they were also sexualizing women outside the parda. So outside the women, the lodge girl, the women who are public performers, cards, any woman carrying water on their heads, for them it's very, very exotic. Also because they have never seen something like this, right? The temple worship, the Devdasis, like this confusion between Devdasi and the courtesan. They're not able to figure out that if a courtesan is a performer, so is a Devdasi, what is the difference between the two? And then you realize there's also the politics of the colonial. How do you write things the way you see? So the funniest thing I read was they call gurus the musical bells. And I was like, okay, there's nothing wrong in that because literally they are the musical bells. But we know as South Asians, as Indians, that they are not just musical bells. They tell you to sort of count the tal and the rhythm, and that's how they are used. But for them, they're musical bells. So when you're reading a travelogue also, you have to understand the limitations, but also the fact that their audiences are not Indian. They are writing it for a very, very European audience. So, and the other was the women behind the parda. The women behind the parda are the most fascinating creatures for the travelers, because till the 18th century end, it's mostly male travelers who can't access the zanana. So whatever they are writing about the women behind the parda, the elite women, is all from hearsay or a fantasy. The interesting thing is what Ruchika argues in the chapter Genealogy of a Harem. I'm so sorry. She says that oftentimes the descriptions of a harem of Ottoman Empire and Mughal Empire are exactly the same. So of course, two spaces you can't have the same harems, but the way in which you perceive the seclusion or the zanana, you basically find the descriptions interchangeable, right? That's why the descriptions remain the same. It's only in the 19th century when we have more and more women travelers that they make an effort to go into those spaces, and then they are viewing the women there. At least they are not writing from a fantasy of why a woman is behind the parda. Is she too pretty? Is she not pretty? Overtly sexual? Asexual? They write all these things in the travel writing. So this chapter basically, I humbly request the Honorable Court of Director, India Affairs, and the Honorable Governor General, Honorable Governor General Supreme Council of Bengal will so far look into and superintend my affairs that the true state of my estate may be laid before them. Also my length of service and the large family of children I left to be brought up, both legitimate and illegitimate, the latter arising from the vigor of youth under the influence of hot climate, distant from my country and cut off from any possibility of forming a more credible and honorable connection at an earlier period. I think the bracket closes here, I'm sorry. I therefore trust they will be considered as deserving of protection and meet with indulgence from my honorable employers, for they are essentially the children of necessity, and alas, the law proves a cruel stepmother to them. I'm out. Of Major Andrew Wilson Nixon, Captain the military service of East India Company Naval Establishment. The bill was filed in 1798. Now, as you can see, this might not be required to be in the will, but it's there, right? Now here, the other term that I came across was the term natural. The way to know if the children are born from a marriage or out of wedlock is the use of the word natural. Children will mean that the children are born out of wedlock. And there is a overt sexualization of women of warmer countries. So saying things like the warmer country excites one terribly. And there's a lot of work by David Arnold who talks about this kind of work. There's also Radhika Singha who talks about so many of the colonial sources talk about this idea that how women from tropical weather, and they use this word, I'm sorry, it will be ripen early. That's the term they basically use compared to the older countries. They explain a lot of them, they explain a lot of presence of courtesans in religious ceremonies as an example of this overt sexualization, which they don't realize being done by them more than anybody else in the 18th century. So this chapter basically used some of the wills, but also a lot of travelogue to talk about that when the early Europeans come to India, what is the image with which they are reaching here? Because they are reading these travelogues, they are reading letters from the people who have already come here. The impression and what is the image that is there in their mind as they step in South Asia. Now, the chapters after that focus largely on the legal archive. Now, what all is contained in the legal archive? Of course, bequests, there are contentions, other matters of the law, there are mundane lived experiences and impressions of the other, even more so 18. Colonial constructions, of course, come later, and they make it more stark, of course. In fact, I would like to argue that 18th, even 17th century and 18th century travel writings, whatever is seen as exotic, exactly those aspects are related in the 19th century, whether it's the notch law or the sati. Everything in the 17th, 18th century. I remember seeing this Dutch painting where sati is being shown, and there's so much of action in that painting. It's almost like animated kind of a painting. I'm sorry for not painting with me here, but I realized that it's not a critique of sati. It's a sort of imagining how hyper the entire situation or the space would look like. So how is it that 17th, 18th century, something they find very fascinating, becomes the same thing in 19th century, becomes something that they need to regulate because their role has changed from being a trading empire, from being early administrators after the Battle of Buxar and Plassey. Now they are the ones who get to decide morally how and what should be done and in whatever way they might want to. So, I don't want to go to the debate between Lata Mahi, Tarika Sarkar, Jyoti Agarwal. They have done a debate where how interesting is it that even in the laws against sati, the conversation is praising the British for having done. It's very chivalrous, the language almost, other than the other aspects. Here also this will that we see is a recreation. It's a will where you can read the two names Kovali and Raje. This is a will of a person who has, like a polygamous household. And it's a long will. I'll talk about it if you want to later. Okay, some of the paintings that the book has used for the chapter Beyond Parda have been these. This is, again, you can see women bathing at ghats, women doing mundane household activities become extremely exoticized. William Hodges, the painter, who also wrote a very elaborate diary, he can't get over women carrying water on their heads. It's a very eroticized, exotic image, something which perhaps people who have water through the river, for them it's a daily chore, right? But for them it's a sight to behold. I'm not sure if it's a painter in him, or the man in him, or the British in him, or maybe an overlap of all three, which that finds this very, very fascinating. The other one is a very interesting painting of a Notch woman at Faizabad by Tilly Kettle. Tilly Kettle became overnight sensation in Britain. Paintings of Awadh Nawab and his 5 sons. He became so rich because, of course, the painting, the exhibition opened up, and some of the paintings of Faizabad by Tilly Kettle have been, of course, they are very beautiful, but you can see the trees behind look almost like English countryside actually. And that's sort of transposing of how you consider a space your own. I would like to argue. The other two images here are the lady's maid and the ayah. Again, a very, very interesting and important figure. There's a lot of research happening on ayahs and ammas. Swapna Banerjee, Shalini Grover, they're doing some amazing work. And Shalini is another old Stephanian, but they run an entire project. Please do visit their website. It's called ayahhamma.com. They've done an entire project on the histories, videos and postcards of ayahs all over the world. But you realize that ayahs become the kind of figures who are moving between the European and Indian spaces quite freely. They are vilified, as Charugupta's work has shown, because also they are marginalized caste location, but they're still essential. They're as essential to bring up the children sometimes as wet nurses. They're very, very important people, but yeah, talked about quite often in the sources. The next chapter in my book is called Forging Intimacies, and I think for me this was the most important chapter because again the dilemma was, if I'm looking at the wills from 1775 onwards, they're about 1830s. How do I classify the wills? If I've seen about 500 wills, how do I classify them? Military, non-military, Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, region-wise. And I thought it perhaps would be very easy to do that. So I wanted to do it thematically. If I read all the wills, what are the themes that I come across? And can I classify the wills by the themes? Because one will might carry 2-3 themes. So it would be unfair if I use one will and only one theme and not talk about all other aspects carried in the will. So for example, I'll have a list of the sub-themes also. to start with this lovely quote by Anne Stoddard. The romanticized view of these domesticities, or even the focus on management of the intimate, leads to a tenderized study of colonialism if it ignores the violence and inequities lodged in privatized space and turns away from the uses and abuses that unsolicited and even desired intimacies may entail. Unquote. Now, this is my favorite joke that whenever I've done a book talk, somebody or the other have always asked me about love. That is their love in the wills. And I tell them that there is everything but love in the wills. Okay? Because wills are not the space to express love. It may be a space to express care, maybe to express concern, maybe control also for that matter, power, because you're leaving something for somebody. There is contention, there is fight, there is sexual violence in legal archives. But love, there is no space for love in the legal sources. So I would highly disagree with William Dalrymple kind of a research which romanticized in White Mughal relationship between the James Kirkpatrick and Khayyam. And we openly disagree on this matter because it does not like me mentioning the idea of wages and emoluments. The fact that these women in live-in relationships or concubines of the British men, the wills will talk about some kind of a wage, some kind of an emolument, some kind of money being paid to her, because that's what puts them under the category of service, getting paid. Okay, I'll talk about that. But the moment you remove that aspect, you forget that these are also asymmetrical relationships. They are asymmetrical not just by gender, because by that logic, almost all gender relationships may be asymmetrical, but these are also asymmetrical because of race, colonizer man, colonized woman. They are also class. The man is the one who's bequeathing the property to the woman. And also the voice. We only hear most of the version of the relationships from the voice of the white man. I'm saying white man in quotes. Okay? White man. So, of course, the asymmetry is very, very obvious. So, I don't want to go to the perspective of Indani Chatterjee. We want to consider all concubinage as slavery. I think I would perhaps want to make it more complex and sort of complicate the whole idea that there were a lot of different relationships. And for me, class becomes a very important issue, and I will tell you about it. I think that this is again a very beautiful painting made by Francisco Rinaldi, the most famous portraiture painters comes to India. This is a painting that is often used about Dhaka muslin. Many of the Instagram influencer kind of historians talk about it, but that's not why academic historians should talk about it. We will look at it and give you 10 other aspects to analyze, because academic scholars have a different influence on Instagram actually. So when you look at her, you look at the way she's sitting, and we know, the painting describes her as the BB of a British Englishman in Dhaka. So again, the way she's dressed up, the way she is, for me, it shows that she was, part of a household of a rich Englishman. That's what I would say. Look at the carpet, look at the jewelries, look at the jewelry. She's wearing beautiful silver jewelry. The hookah looks exquisite. So the entire appearance and the curtains at the back, the Bengali window that you have, all of it gives the appearance of a very elite household. Yeah, not just the muslin cloth that she's wearing. So these were the themes that I focused in this particular chapter. I'll talk about each of them and give you some examples. Popular names, unknown identity. So most of the wills will not mention the actual name of the BB or the concubine. They will mention names like Mary, Polly, Becky. Okay. Now, one very, very obvious reason would be they're easy to pronounce. Rather than calling like Murad Baksh, you rather want to call her Becky. Right? When it's a language that you're familiar with, it's easier to pronounce for you, right? But what it does for anybody researching on these women, it renders them ahistoric. It renders them faceless, nameless. In a way, we have no identities for them. We can't situate them. We can't locate where they are from. At the same time, some wills will give you the details. So a will say, my girl from Rohilla region, my girl from Bengal, my Delhi, my friend from Delhi. When you have wills that talk about it, at least you can situate the women geographically where she would have come from. Some wills will give you the details. They'll give her popular name and they'll give, one of my Bengali friends says, maybe it's a Bangla thing, the Dhaka Bengal now. I said, yeah, that possibly could be true, but then they'll mention the good name and the nickname, but they don't. They're only mentioning her by one name. There's one will where the woman is mentioned by her 5 second names. Elizabeth, alias this, alias this, alias this, because she may have lived in with 4 different British men. And the man leaving bequeath for her wanted to ensure it should reach the right Elizabeth. So he writes all the names she might have been known by in any of the documentation. So again, when you read these details, you have to understand that's why for historians, reading the language and what is being said and how it is being said becomes very important. Durba Ghosh, in one of the excellent articles on this whole politics of naming, she says that it's a very powerful move. Even now, oftentimes we see women changing their second name after marriage. I mean, of course, we often say it's a choice. But if it is a choice, I would like to see men changing their names. So we accept that it's a patrilineal society and property is being passed on, but it is expected that women will. Not just that, in some regions, women's first name is also changed after marriage. So anytime you feel, oh, history was so bad, but we are so forward, no, sorry, we are not. We are just few steps ahead, okay? So here, giving a new name to somebody is also a kind of identity that you give them perhaps. So I think I wanted to open this up and without giving a very conclusive thing, because I don't know why you would have done that. All of these are possible reasons. Second is acquiring a baby. How do you acquire a baby? So there were some instances that we come across where William Hinckley has one of his Indian servants, Hirkara, coming to him and saying that there's a very pretty girl who is under debt. She would like to join your household if you pay her the debt off. So one way is this. What is interesting in this story, how much Indian servants are involved in creating these kind of households. I'm not sure if they have a cut in it or something, or if somebody they know, we do not know any of that. But it's also perhaps having an influence over your master, that I am the one bringing you a baby. There is also wills telling if the man is leaving back with, you write the will in 2 situations. If you see you are near the end of your life, or you're going back home. So if the man is going back home, he will recommend the baby to other men, saying that she's very nice, she's very caring, and I will ask my executors to find a good man for her. So this is kind of a recommendation that wills will carry at times, of a good nature and good behavior kind of a thing. So you would acquire. Claude Martin of La Martiniere School, he in his will talks about purchasing the baby, and then he clarifies. Judge him, okay? He says, I'm purchasing her in the sense that her natal family has no right over her. And then he brings them up in their own religious knowledge, educates them in the religion they are born in, and then at some point when they grow of come of age, asks them if they want to marry somebody else or would they want to marry him. I think it sounds a little coercive and a little, but yeah, okay, that's what he writes in his own will. But he mentions how he acquired the baby. So we get this kind of detailed information at times as well. Now, paid for their services, perhaps the most sort of contentious point of this work, because I would like to argue that they are servicing the empire by servicing the men in whose households they are living. Please hear me out and then you can disagree with me if you. The most popular euphemism for concubine is housekeeper. My argument is it's not a euphemism. She was actually a housekeeper. The other euphemism is washerwoman. Not a cute nickname. Literally, she was the washerwoman for the man. It is especially true of the lower class or middle class British men who could not afford a big household. Mind you, in the other private papers and letters, on the complaints the men would have, here you can't have one servant or 2 servants. Remember, works were mostly caste-based. One person who would perform the duties that were of his caste would refuse to go to the house running a house became a very expensive job. So a middle class or a lower middle class British person, soldier or any other position as well, maybe a merchant who's just starting out, for them to afford an entire household would not have been possible. So maybe these were the women living with them. They are the ones who are providing them with the household services, taking care when they were unwell, and on top of why am I saying that? Also their sexual partners and reproductive labor, because they were the mother of their children. The way in which they are described, again I'll come to that in just a bit, their services are sometimes the only way they are mentioned in the will, not by their name. Mother of my child, my faithful friend, my faithful servant. Even women who are in long-term relationships are often referred to by the relationship and not by the name. Now, so they are performing various kind of services. Then we also have those rich households. Rich households will have multiple servants, sometimes more than one partner, native women, and they will not do the household work. They have servants in the household work. But they will be, I'll come to a very interesting court case and then talk about this. But you realize that hierarchy is very clearly visible. Now, companion to take care. So yeah, the most commonly used words by which the native concubines are mentioned is to take care. Again, placing them in the care workspace. For example, if you read the diary of Richard Burton, or if you read Thompson, who's he's in Bengal military, he writes his memoirs. He talks about the fact that how these women will take care of soldiers after they were injured for years, and how they provided a good hand at taking care from local concerns. Richard Burton says how good they were with using local contraceptive methods. And there's a term that is used, this is also a movie based on that, called sleeping dictionary. The fact that how these women would be teaching them the local language, local culture, local sort of know-how about how to survive in a foreign sort of land. So their companionship, their care becomes the most important aspect, about these women. And therefore, when they are being paid, it doesn't seem very surprising, which might seem surprising to an elite sort of relationship, because they are not being paid. They are the sort of a main side of a household, right? But a concubine of a middle class, lower class British household may not have those luxuries. Mixed race social space. So the question is, did mixed race families interact with the white families? No, they did not. You largely have mixed race families interact with other mixed race families. Again, wills come to your rescue. So somebody will say that I'm leaving so and so for your dear friend, my concubine's dear friend. I'm leaving this for her. So again, showing the kind of a warm relationship between the British man and his friends, who might share a good friendly relationship with the concubine. There are also works by Richard Bridgenden, who was an engineer, and he wrote about 75, 40, 80 volumes of diaries during his stay in India. And Peter Robb has done 2 books on the diaries, and he talks a lot about these mixed race interactions. So he talks about if a man dies suddenly, they don't want the woman to fall back into a bad profession, meaning sex work. So how give her some kind of a pension. So again, showing a kind of for mixed race spaces. Now polygamy, again, class issue. Think of the Delhi resident David Octolemy, who would travel on the elephant, the famous story of him having an entire harem of concubines and wives actually. So this is all only wives. I think I would have also politicized a little bit and say that how for most of the Britishers in the 18th century, since they became the kind of mansabdars post-Plassey, the kind of a rule book was very Mughal mansabdari rule book. They wanted to behave like the zamindars and the mansabdars. So they began to live like them. The Bagan Padi, they began to use the term also Bagan Padi, which is a Bangla word, a garden house. So perhaps polygamy also gave them an idea of an elite, rich, powerful existence in the region as well. Conditions apply. I saw some of the wills put very strange conditions on the BBs. that if she remains unmarried after I leave, then you give this much pension. If she behaves a particular way, now it could have two possible reasons. One, of course, the idea of control, of morality, and a kind of possessiveness. So by nature, these are non-marital relationships, but by all practical purposes, they feel like a kind of commitment would be expected. But the other reason could be that if the man is leaving a kind of pension for her, he feels if somebody else is there to take care of her, I may not need to continue to spend money on my concubine. Now, my faithful servant, I think I came across the terms my faithful servant so many times. Again, I know faithful servant, but also my. It sounds too sort of possessive, kind of a word to use like in a will. I mean, you're using it for your partner, it is of course yours only, right? But you specify my faithful servant. So faithful and servant, of course, telling us that they do see them as servants. There is an idea of an emolument. Families here and there and familiar details. These two parts talk about how some wills will have detailed families in England. They will give the address and everything of the family. The wife, children, mother, nephews, nieces, brothers, sister, everybody is being mentioned there. Okay? And then in the same will, they talk about the family is in India. And it's like a very done thing. But some wills, for whatever reason, I think, I will say multiple reasons, will only mention the native concubine and the children. Perhaps, maybe because they came here very young, and the average age was not very high. If you read Theon Wilkinson's Two Monsoons, he says in the 18th century, the average age of a British or any European in India was 2 monsoons, because they continued to live, eat and drink like they were in Europe, which was the last thing you should do when you were in a warm climate, right? So it took them some time to start wearing cotton, wearing chappals and wearing pagdis and cotton headgear rather than wearing their hats and leather boots and drink their alcohol like they're drinking in a cold country. But still the average age was quite less. So maybe if they come here at an early age, the Indian family sometimes was the only family they actually, right? So which brings to the next chapter. The previous chapter was all the concern, but is it only that? No. You find a lot of contention, a lot of discord over property, and there is violence. So this chapter uses wills as well as court cases. Now, bequeath until her natural life. Now, this is a very interesting idea that most of the women were not given the property without any condition. It's not like, okay, it's yours, do whatever the hell you want to do. No, it was not that way. The right to use the property as long as she was alive. And then it will go back to the children or to a family in Europe, but not to the woman. Very few, I think I would say, almost maybe 5% of the wills will have the entire property and money being given to the woman. So the idea that in Indian laws, we know the law systems did not have the idea of women owning the immovable property. But even in the English law, the law of coverture basically tells us that even after a marriage, the wife's property, which her parents may have given her, to the husband. Think of Jane Austen. Yeah? So the idea of property going to the husband is the done thing even in the British law. So you find that that's a very new idea. But we nonetheless have some men who leave the property. And then we find very few, but some wills where these mixed race households women bequeathing that property to their own social networks. And they will call themselves BB Betty, BB Elizabeth. These are the names in the wills. And the wills will say this will was originally in Persian and then it was translated. Now here comes the politics of translation and transliteration. For me, the biggest loss, I mean, I can't read Bangla, but I could read basic Persian at some point. I would not know what was the word and terms she used for herself. I mean, maybe there were certain words of 18th century that may have been in usage. How the mixed race families saw themselves, maybe a Persian term or a Bangla word, it's lost to us forever. Because she spoke the will in Bangla or in Persian, but it's the transliteration in English, by an English term. So again, another loss is the loss of the jewelry, the food vessels to somebody, their granddaughters, their khansama, they use the word khansama, the cook, the bawarchi, some other servant, to a friend, again telling us the social network of these women who they were giving the stuff to. Some of these women are very popular women. For example, this Ricketts family. These are families who generational trees are found. You can sort of Google them online and you will see that some of these women do come from extremely established Anglo-Indian families as well. Now, the third sub-theme was under the purview of the court, disputed domesticities. Now, disputed domesticities had some wills which had clear-cut contention. So, a will which was written, the will had a codicil after a few weeks, saying that the previous will stand cancelled because so and so my BB had taken a bond and run away from me. So she has taken the bond, but in my conscience, I owe her the last few months' salary. But still, I am cancelling my previous will. There are similar such more wills where you can see the contention, being played out in a will as well. I saw two very fascinating court cases. One is the court case of PUBB and Henry Pine. Henry Pine was in Chittagong and he is, considered to be a very violent person. His license to trade was cancelled after this case. But for this case, PUBB is living in a household with her siblings and Henry Pine attacks the house, snatches the box of jewelry and takes it back. All the neighbors hear the ruckus, they see the fight happening. The court case in Hyde Papers talks about the fact that how PUBB, the siblings are giving testimony. She is the bread earner of the family. The siblings talk about it. PUBB is with other master, she's not in the court case. But the siblings say she's the bread earner and the jewelry that was taken by Henry Pine as his is not given by him. It was given by the previous masters to PUBB. So it's a theft. It's not his. Then comes the side of Henry Pine, who says no, the jewelry was given by me, and that is why I only took what is mine. I never caused any violence. I never broke whatever things he gives. His household Indian servants, of course, testify for Henry Pine. But the testimonies bring out something very interesting. The multiple partners and the kind of openness about the multiple partners and the jewelry given by them, she being the bread earner and things like these. And the court doesn't even hear the entire testimonies. It decides against PUBB. And a few months after this incident, Henry Pine is found to be extremely violent and his license to trade is revoked. He has to go down. Second case, and perhaps the most fascinating case, was Bhagwan Kumar and William Orbe Hunter. Now, William Orbe Hunter and Bhagwan Kumar have a very rich household and they have multiple slaves and servants. They specify who the servant and the slave. Because for slave you have the paper of ownership and the deeds, etc. Now here the servants, one of the servants, her nose and ears were cut. Now the blame is whether William Orbe Hunter got them cut or it was Bhagwan Kumar who got them cut. That's the case. Now the two lawyers are fighting whether or not concubinage is a contract or a service in the laws of India, because that will change the entire nature of the court case itself. And what we've come across in the court case are multiple details. For example, when the judge asks Taji Bibi, one of the servants, that we heard that almost all the servants had sexual relations with William Orbe Hunter, she says yes. You too, she goes quiet. She actually on the record doesn't say anything. Again, I mean, you can see that it perhaps meant yes. Then the other servant gave the of William Orbe Hunter every morning carried the breakfast in bed for Bhagwan Kumar. I don't think I've ever heard anybody carrying bedroom, nashta in 18th century. I don't think any other record perhaps will give us that information. For me, what is interesting is that it shows us the class, that they have multiple servants, but Bhagwan Kumar will not be called a washerwoman. She will not be called a housekeeper because she is the main side of an entire rich household. Now, in the end, when the judgment is reached, they say that both are held guilty. But Bhagwan Kumar is held guilty for cutting the nose and ears, since she's more prone to having done that because she's born in the land of spices. That's what the court case says. And William Orme Hunter, because within his household he let this happen. That's it. It's a very long court case. I think both Durga and Elizabeth Polsky also have worked on this case because it's a very fascinating case. It has too many twists and turns and too many testimonies are being given. But yeah, so this becomes the last part of this chapter was the violence and the assault. Two cases that I saw were the cases of sexual assault against two underage young girls. One by a French man, another by a British man. What I want to highlight is that what was common between the two court cases, both the young women were found, and by found I mean found by the perpetrator of the rape, in the mixed race social space. So the guy says, I thought she was open to a mixed race household relationship. And I asked her if she is a virgin or not. So again, you see how sexual violence, the language hasn't changed a lot. What is interesting is, in one case, the testimony of an Indian midwife, and I checked that in British law, also English law in particular, a lot of rape cases, testimonies have the final say by the midwife, who will do the actual examination of marks of violence and if the girl had reached puberty, etc. Here she gives the detail, and this lady who is being called here as the Sidhu Bhai, she is a regular in the police cases on sexual violence, but her testimony is not taken into acknowledgement. Whereas in the other court, when the British doctor actually says that the girl is lying, she had reached puberty. It's his word is taken against the word of the person whose servant that girl is, who's saying that she's not yet reached puberty. I have the documentation of her age. This is a girl called Clara, who specifies I'm a Hindu girl drama, because these are the kind of 18th century sort of legal parlance that you find in these kind of words. So this chapter again talks about how legal spaces can also be contentious. My last chapter is on interracial progeny. Here again, this bill I have used talks about the girl who's being sent back home to Europe. Now, till early 90s, it's very common for the mixed race children to be sent back home, and by that home I would mean Europe. Again, also perhaps because a lot of the rich men have the kind of access, they have the kind of resources for the children to be taken care of, but they would consider the home. So the mother will have no right over the children. So some bills will talk about that please take the children away from her very carefully, don't hurt her, don't it's already tough for her. I would like to believe the logic remains both patrilineal, patriarchal as but on the other side, it will also give the woman the freedom to join the household of another British man, which was again something not a problematic thing. Now, what was the attitude of the state, of the early colonial state, or of East India Company? In 1680s, the only sort of board director dictat that comes is that any child who gets baptized should be given kind of incentive. This is also the time when we have Portuguese, French also present in India. It would be a way to compete with their presence. But other than that, if the British presence, the British state did not make any laws in favor or to support their rights or to make sure they get their wages and emoluments, they didn't do anything to stop it also. Because wherever you have colonial rule, you have these kind of mixed race relationships. It's kind of, if I can say, the byproduct of colonial presence in regions. And since colonial presence largely remains a masculinist enterprise, the gendered hierarchy will be colonial men and colonized women. There is also this will where Charles Nicholson Sr. tells his children who are going to India, he recommends them not to associate them or form a family connection with black or dark brown native prodigies or any other low description of people, but with honest, industrious Europeans of respectable character, education and connection, or their children be moderately white and in a situation to maintain them comfortably. Now this is 1890. By then, there is no sort of hidden sort of thing about colonialism. It's quite clear, it's quite visible, it's in your face kind of colonial presence. But here in this will, what I want to talk about is that since a lot of mixed race children are not being sent home, many orphanages come up for them. They are being given education. Please remember that this is also post-Heidi revolution. There's a fear of mixed race. So in the 1790s, when a lot of anti-mixed race children policies are being made, that how they will not do particular post in the railways. These are the policies that are happening simultaneously. I would like to argue that social legal sphere often go hand in hand as far as social biases and social racial sort of differentiation are concerned. So yeah, so many of these children will end up marrying other mixed race children, and at times there would be social gatherings, balls being organized where the mixed race daughters who have been taught in proper education can meet British men who are coming to India. But again, the color discrimination, as you can see, of lighter color, brown, dark brown natives are unknown and things like that. So just to conclude, I would like to argue that there is no dedicated archive or native, but that itself tells us that there is a gendering of the archive, not so much the lack of women and women's history in there. So what was it native women and relationship with the British man that made her remain unnamed, alternatively named, and even to get mentioned merely as a role possible? So perhaps they were considered important for the role they played in the life. I mean, there is this will where the man mentions his dogs, his children, but not his concubine. Maybe because the concubine has already moved to somebody else, but still there is no name of the mother. Considering that they are so careful as record keepers, the child's mother doesn't find mention in the will. The natives and how they were impacted by colonial policies from the 18th to the early 19th century are not denied their presence in history, only their version of it. From 1810 onwards, we don't find the existence of the native women in the wills. So the argument is, oh, maybe because more white women were coming. So how clever is it that you are putting native women against the white women? Women is women's biggest enemy, kind of a trope, very, very patriarchal trope you're throwing in our faces. But you realize that even the white women are being sent here as with a role in their mind. There is this manual I saw of 1830s which said a man remains proper man only under the gaze of a woman of his race. So imagine the kind of burden you're placing on the shoulder of a white woman also. And then when she comes here, mixed race domesticities become less, you blame her. Oh, she changed the romanticized, beautiful thing. My argument is, in the Mufassal regions, in the faraway regions, these relationships still existed because there are very few Europeans in those regions. But they are not being talked about. They are disreputable, but these women, of course, these relationships existed. Think of Lal Bazaars, where you actually have sanctioned sex workers for the white men. There is Sumanta Banerjee's work, there is Philippa Levy, an excellent work on venereal diseases, the acts, which sort of talk about them. So a lot of research has already been done, and I really, really enjoy those writings. Now the issue of class has to be that how when we speak about these relationships, the class hierarchy is too stark. Not just what they are leaving and what they are bequeathing. Of course, that too. I mean, imagine somebody saying, I'm leaving you a pension of, at that time, 7,000 Sikka rupees, whatever pension that comes on monthly. That time, it was a good amount. And all her jewelry, all her clothes, all her bedding, crockery, furniture, sometimes it's all left. But money and property is very rarely left to the lower ranking British individuals or officials may not have had a host of servants in their household, and therefore the euphemism becomes more than just a euphemism. Thank you so much.
We'll open the floor for questions, so thankfully, and then
what is their status? Is there a race discrimination in terms of treatment given to a white concubine as against the native concubine? First. Second, is this question of what about concubines of Indians and Bengal or the Bengali Muslim or people who are of a very high status, and this there and moving into the 19th century, because more than the legal aspect, here what also is to be looked at as a point of concern the other social implications. So how do you look at the social / legal status of YGs of these Indian Muslim? And here I want to focus on a particular case which became very famous scandal. This is called the Concubinage incident, which happens in the 1850s and 1860s. Not very sure about the date. And this is not a legal case but a social case, where this person, Concubinage, who is a distant relative of the Doctor family at Hasula, he has kept a concubine named Anarudini. Right. Now here again, so it's not only race, it's also religion which comes into it. So he has kept a concubine called Anarudini of the Muslim. And obviously he's in love with her, so he actually donates an entire Baganbadi to her, the Velegata Baganbadi, which is now the tax office Velegata. Okay. The sales tax office. The current sales tax office Velegata was actually the Baganbadi for Anarudini built by Concubinage. Now here the issue was not legal, but here gaining legitimacy. So when Concubinage Doctor's mother passed away, he had to actually, and obviously he had to perform a last rite. So he had to get in Brahmins. A lot of these Brahmins were dominated by the Shubhabaja Rajbari. They refused because of religious reasons. And of course, Shubhabaja Rajbari is the Rajbari of Radhakant Dev, and of course traditional orthodoxy. So then he had to actually approach the opposing Rajbari, which is the Bihara Shubhabaja Rajbari, and they have. So, you know, have you come across similar cases of social stigma associated with concubinage for Indian men? Because it's not so much the case with the East India Company officials or the English officials, but Indians keeping concubines. So, as of now, these are the two main points that I have.
Which time period will that be for this case, the Kalipra Dattu case?
Kalipra Dattu case, I think 1860s or 1870s. I am not very clear about that. I don't remember the date exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's 1860s or 1870s.
Can we take another question?
So I wanted to ask about again the social status of these concubines. Not differentiated like this question, but how did the native quote unquote society treat or think about these concubines who were servicing the British men, and also whether did they have their own incentives to get into such relationships? Like for example, a survival incentive maybe went up the social ladder. So I don't know about the incentives, but did they have those things?
I was wondering that can we take the name change to perhaps suggest a culturation of the native woman, or was she exclusively to be kept behind closed, especially for women who did want to inherit property?
I think I will take up these questions first. So, so far as Indian and European concubines are concerned, again it becomes very difficult to ascertain because a lot of times these women do have some rosario. So it's difficult to understand whether these were mixed race women with some kind of a Portuguese influence, or these were women who had converted. Since the only records they exist in these wills. So their sort of social existence, the trail kind of goes cold after these wills. There's no way of knowing. The wills which may have had a space to carry a line or two about them, I don't think it considers them that important. The only place where you might still find some details were the Descendants' diaries, which Peter Rock talks about, and yeah, and he does talk about the fact that how some of them will speak fluent English, either because they were mixed race children or they lived in those spaces and they picked up. So at some point he's very taken aback by this person who's speaking extremely good English, what he calls good English, because he doesn't expect that to happen. It's a difficult thing to ascertain whether any particular concubine, particularly the wills, is Indian or she is somebody who is European. Although we do find references to presence of European sex workers, etc., in some of the travelogues and some sort of writing of 18th and 19th century. But other than that, from wills and legal archives per se, I think it's quite difficult to ascertain that. As far as Indian men's concubines are concerned, I think I would like to believe that Indian men had an entire social setup. And the fact that for the rich it was a matter of prestige, that the whole idea of masculinity, to have multiple partners, that they could afford to have. It's not even sexual, it's very, very power driven kind of a statement. Baganbadi was more than anything else a sort of a status symbol. Like you can afford to have a status, like a symbol like a Baganbadi. So I think in my mind, when I think of that time and that era, I would like to believe that the rich British officials, merchants, there are coach makers, there are people who are clock makers, the bills will specify their professions. They would like to emulate the way in which the British, the Indian zamindars, the Indian sort of mansabdars, jagirdars would have maintained and established their household. They will have those coaches, they'll go in the evening to the Maidan and sort of take a ride with their concubines. They were never in the parda. Concubines did not have the sort of seclusion or the upper caste, upper class essentialization of that they have to live in a parda. They did not follow those. At least the writings that I have come across do not talk about any such sort of social barrier or social kind of a even a class kind of a statement. As in?
As in, like in the case of Concubinage, the fact that he had to actually, he was ostracized, he could not even perform the last rites properly of his mother. He was not allowed to initially because the Brahmins are being controlled by one particular Rajbari of Calcutta. He has to then approach the opposite Rajbari to allow their Brahmins to come and actually perform.
Which could be more of a caste barrier if you think about it. I think for European men that would not have been a barrier at all in any way. So I don't think this kind of a situation would have come up in the European scenario. Because these kind of concepts of caste, purity, these are more sort of South Asian kind of concepts in that way. I hope I've answered your questions. We'll have a discussion about them afterwards. Coming to your questions. So the social status is never an issue. In fact, whenever a British person comes to India, they are struck by how sort of nonchalant everybody is, by how okay it is whether you have a married partner or a non-married partner. There were some Indian men who married many of these women. There was this will, I could not show it, of Nathaniel Leonard, whose will talks about that how he married the woman, and he's asking for an apology from his mother back at home, because he's saying, I'm leaving you the same amount of money as I'm leaving my Indian family, but I have my children to take care of. It's almost like a letter. He doesn't give anything to his relatives back at home, and he apologizes for that. So you can imagine that there is a sort of sense of a family, a familial space, but when they are new, they can't imagine how is it so okay in India. But perhaps one of the reasons somebody said is also because of the upper class polygamy and acceptance of that maybe, and the fact that rich will always have concubines, and by always I mean the option of having concubines perhaps being there. So in the Indian mindset, there is no social stigma, and whatever social stigma Europeans carry with them, if they live here a little longer time, I think they learn to acknowledge and accept that, and accept that it's how it is, and kind of maybe partake in the same system as well if they want to. I remember reading a letter written by a British man to his wife. He asks his wife to join him in Bengal. And when she refuses to join, he says that the tropical weather excites one terribly. So either you come or I'll have a concubine. Like a threatening letter he writes to the wife, you know. And even if it's in a jest, it tells you that how they would want to view this as. Which is why, again and again, the reference is to the hot weather. You said the incentive. Now that's a very interesting way to look at it. I would want to see it as a profession. When for them, if the idea of a salary or a wage, and even in the will, if the men may not give her money, some kind of pension is given. And Vigendan writes, if a man dies or leave the providing for a woman, the other men will put in their money and provide her with some pension so she doesn't become a sex worker. So it will be some kind of a responsibility. It's only in the 1829 that they opened a widower's fund, by the way. But for that, you had to submit a marriage proof. Only in the military. It's for the military. Open only for first the white women and then for even the native whites. But they had to give a certificate of marriage. So until then, there is no other any arrangements being made. Socially, it could be done by men. So I think I would want to see it as a profession and a professional kind of a space, because money is being mentioned very, very normally. There is no shame. There is no. I mean, Piru Bibi's brother and sister mentioned that he owes her last few months' salary, and they say that she travelled with him outstation, for which means going out of the station with the master would have meant something, even additional incentive or money. Yeah, but it's being talked about very normally in the court case. Sorry, to your question, I think it's a very interesting point again, but I'm not sure if it was done by the women themselves, because the names are very, very common. It's like few names being repeated again and again. Mary, Polly, Becky, Betty, Elizabeth is something I found. Most of the names. Some of them do talk about the given name, and in fact, in 2 wills, the children were named. They were called bastard children. Instead of called illegitimate or natural children. Now that's quite honest, but rather than using a euphemism, you have to use the proper word. So I think maybe the idea that legal space doesn't require poetic expressions. It expected that you will say things so clearly, so it's known who it has to go to. So maybe, it could have been a possibility, but I'm not sure if women were choosing the names themselves or not. Does it answer your question? Should I add something?
Yeah, I mean more in terms of were they sort of encouraged to adopt British etiquettes or mannerisms in that way, or were they simply to be behind closed doors women and being the concubine was an addition to their service?
So these women largely came from the marginalized social sections. Of course, we do have some women from the royal, for example, this particular family of peers, they have a book. There's also a very famous family of hearsays. I'm in touch with one of their descendants who's now in Pune, and he talks about this property, that property, they are, I think 6-7 generations ago. These families married into the elite. Women married into their families, but they were also very high-ranking officials. Other than that, it will be difficult to ascertain. But one thing is definitely clear, that these women were not in seclusion. They would socialize very freely. They will interact with other women very freely. The only very interesting fact is that white women never socialized with mixed race households. In a way, kind of a, this is a kind of a. I'm not sure if it's immoral, but it's a kind of, of course, patriarchy would want to call it a threat, but I don't think it's simply a threat. It's also an alternate kind of a family structure that you will not want to condone, perhaps. Yeah, my pleasure.
I just had a general question about the institution of concubinage late 18th, 19th century, because thinking about medieval Rajput or Mughal, be it households, or even the Nawab kingdom in 18th, 19th century, Upper Bengal, concubines had a ritualized status. So when they were initiated into the household, it was celebrated with festivity. There were particular ranks which were given. In our, we know that, there was, you were talking about social mobility. There was a way in which from a notch girl or a courtesan you became a pari within the household, and then a concubine, and then a begum. Hazrat Mahal is an example of this. And there are certain rituals associated with each rank, etc., customs, dress as well. We were talking about how within the colonial setup in this period, there is a discussion on whether this is a contract or a service. Is it seen as a formal ritualized position? Are there rituals or mannerisms, like Anish was saying, associated with these concubines? And just one more thing, if we have time, very famous concubine of this period to a European Begum Sam.
Yeah,
Thinking of her,
mentioned.
right? Because you were talking about how these women have been romanticized. She's been idealized and romanticized as someone who's sold into prostitution at a young age. And this young Farzana becomes Begum Sam, who has so much property in Shahjahanabad and Meerut, and is like the adopted daughter of the Mughal king. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So there are no rituals per se, but you do realize that it's some kind of a social understanding. Like if a woman meets a man, how would she meet a man? So the Indian social circle or the Indian servants often play a role in getting these relationships. Or even British men might praise their BP, and it's a very done thing, it's a very acceptable thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine there wouldn't have been jealousies or something like that. But there may also have been a kind of an, like for example, there are relationships that continue for 30 years, and the Wills mentioned that this is a relationship for over 30 years. And there are also relationships that sort of break off after some time. So William Hickey mentions this relationship where he says that the child that was born to him was darker in complexion, and one day he came early from home and he saw the gardener leave the bedroom, and how he actually believed that the child to be the gardener's and not his, and he throws the woman out without any explanations. And when you read Descendant, which matches with this, and how there could be a lot of halla, a lot of crying, and a lot of dramatic. They oftentimes racialize these descriptions, that this is how these people will behave. The other sort of thing I found was that how the fear that natives will misuse the law against the whites. It's often there in the writing. But other than that, I found no sort of legal document or any kind of signing or any kind of ritual, because if you look at the medieval political culture, concubine, as many concubines will mean sort of Veer and Shangaras coming together. It's a male prowess of the ruler that you're highlighting. His prowess will also mean that he can take care of his enemies as well, right? So it's a very nice way to enhance the public masculine image of a ruler. But that's not the purpose, with which these people will have the concubines. It could be simply, a kind of sexual, social, personal, service kind of relationship where all these roles could be played by one, multiple, and there's a possibility of a contentious relationship coming to an end and then somebody else joining the household as well. So I don't see, because if there were rituals or if there was some kind of documentation, that would have maybe systematized it a lot more. So sex workers in the Lal Bazaar are, you have the documentation, their checkups, have the physical checkups, etc. But nothing of that sort at all for the concubines. And Begum Sambhu, I think, is quite fascinating. I've always thought that both Begum Sambhu and Cleopatra are always thought about for their softness, whereas they're such sturdy, strong, powerful women. They always sort of talked about in such softer terms. I feel that their souls must be like churning. Why are we talking about us in such a softer, nicer way? We were more vilified than this, So yeah, I wish Begum Sambhu we talked about as a more powerful woman. The kind of impact she has in the Shahjahanabad politics and the Haveli, the facade of the Haveli, and the presence of her space in the capital Delhi itself speaks for how powerful she must have been. But yeah, I think I'm quite fascinated by Begum Sambhu. Thank you.
different alias names.
Surnames.
Yeah, so
Second name.
yeah. So the purpose for that was so that the boy reaches the right person. That is one reason. But you can take this example, and it's generally known by the charity model. There was this general acknowledgement amongst the British officers themselves that the concubines they have, they might have had been the concubines of other British men earlier, and they might be concubines of other British men later as well. So they have that idea already in them. So how do these British men see this kind of feeling? Is there a sense of understanding that women are ours? So they don't give a damn about who are owning or who are with these women. So again, I think the question really boils down to the part which you said that it's a very repeated question about love, maybe. So what is?
I'm sorry, I don't see love here. I don't have it. Maybe there is. I would like to believe there is emotional intimacy. And intimacy, of course, one major component of intimacy would be love, but not the simple very Bollywood kind of the love that we see at this time. But maybe perhaps a more kind of a shared space, maybe shared experiences, and even if it's filmy kind of, maybe that is there, let's accept it is there as well. But what I find is that the wills will not carry that kind of information by nature of will. So a man, in many of the that okay, this children I have, I'm leaving this, and if after my death, 9 or 10 months after my death, a child is born, then him also or her also. So they're already sort of, as long as the man is alive, your loyalty is towards the man. So William Hickey, when he realizes that he saw the gardener come out of the bedroom, he just assumes that this is sexual infidelity and asks her to leave immediately with a child, of course, right? So this is actually one of the observers, right? When he comes to India for the first time, the British observer says that these may not be marital relationships, but the expectation of faithfulness remains very, very marital. Because these are men who are also going to watch lodge performances, and many a times these European travelers, I'm not sure if it's true or if it's a sexualization of women or not women, that how they could choose their partners if they wanted to be their partners. It could have been perhaps sex work. It may not have been. It could be a kind of a colonial fantasy. But the fact that the expectation of loyalty stays, of course, on the woman. So they may not have been married, but the expectation, of course, remains the same. And again, about sexual jealousy, it's so hard to sort of read that in a legal document. But yeah, I think it's too human, no?
There was this mention of my faithful son.
Yeah, I kept on thinking of it in more ownership. Even in current times when people keep on holding their partner, I'm like, she's not running away anywhere, relax, But yeah, it could be a sort of symbolism of affection and everything, but you can read it through that sort of lenses. So yeah, maybe, but that's an interesting interpretation.
Thank you. On behalf of the History Society, I express my gratitude to Dr. Ruchika Sharma. We were glad to be able to gain a better understanding of your work on women in early Bengal and the way you use sources to reconstruct histories. I would request Dr. Kazmi to present ma'am with a memento as a token of our appreciation. We would also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Sabina Kazmi, our staff advisor, and Mukesh sir and Feroz sir, without whom this event would not have been possible. Finally, a big thank you to all of you in the audience who joined us today and made this event a success. Thank you so much. We hope to meet